Okay, welcome everyone. This is our first podcast for deep dive into the Coptic liturgy, and we're here to dive deep into the liturgy with Abuna Antonios, Hegeman of Archangel Michael and St. Bishoy Church in Sydney, Australia, and we also have Mina Sami, lecturer of intro to the Coptic liturgy and rites. Okay, welcome.
At St. Cyril's College.
At St. Cyril's College.
Yes. That's
right. Theological College. Welcome. Today we want to talk a bit more about the liturgy and dive deep into the history of our liturgy, the Coptic liturgy. We want to understand a bit more about how this beautiful rite came about. Where did it start? We would love to hear more from you. I know, Mark, we always speak about the liturgy.
We have many prepared questions, but I believe this is just going to be a bit of a general introduction, with some emphasis on the historical aspect, but definitely what we want to take out of it is kind of how to approach the liturgy personally. So
yeah. So maybe a quick question just to start us off. The Last Supper with Jesus, right? That's the first reference to the Eucharist in the New Testament. What happened after that?
Well, I'm sure Mina's going to be able to give you a proper detailed historical account, but for me, I think one of the lovely things to think about, and I'm really glad you started with the Last Supper, is that every liturgy that has ever happened in the world is kind of itself the Last Supper. We tend to think as modern people of time as being a straight line, and you're moving along at the speed of 1 minute per minute, and whatever you leave behind is back there, whatever you're waiting, in the future is still to come. But when we come to speak about our relationship with a God who goes beyond time and space, categories like that aren't going to work anymore. And one of the things that really touched me in the liturgy is that every instance of a liturgy is kind of like, there are funguses that live in the soil under the ground, and apparently there are some of them where it's just one individual fungus that sprouts many mushrooms. And I think the record was something like 3 kilometers across or something for a single fungus. Thousands of little mushrooms springing up everywhere, and yet under the ground, it's all really just the one organism. And that's how I think, like every Sunday liturgy, every weekday liturgy, Australia, America, Egypt, wherever you are, they're little mushrooms sprouting out of this one thing, which is that sacrificial giving of Christ, giving his body and his blood to us. And the funguses in one place take a particular color, in one place they get taller, in another place they get wider, and so on. But they're all really the same thing. But I think Mina can give you a better answer as to how that actually played out in history.
With emphasis on the fungus.
You only have to cover 2,000 years.
I mean, like the other side of it, because I think it's important actually to have these analogies that make things very relatable to everybody, because I think only the historical things just tell you facts, but at the same time you want to be able to relate to something more that you experience every week. So the historical aspect is, given Jesus' command at the Last Supper, do this in remembrance of me, that's exactly what they started doing. And what they started doing was, and we know this from the book of Acts, so the Christians would still pray in the synagogues with Jews, and then they would break bread at home. So they would have the Eucharist at home. And originally it was just like the setting of the Last Supper, meaning it was a meal and with the Eucharist as well. So just like Jesus did. Eventually, as the Christian faith grew, people started to allocate dedicated spaces to celebrate the Eucharist. So instead of having it at somebody's dining table, people would buy houses and dedicate them to be at church.
And is that from time of the apostles, roughly?
Yeah, so this is very early on, 1st, 2nd, maybe 3rd century even. And the critical point at the 4th century, of course, was the acceptance of Christianity into the public realm. So first it was legalized in the Edict of Milan, and then Christianity was made to be the religion of the empire in the Edict of Thessalonica. So at that point, Christians finally had the liberty to build large churches, build cathedrals. This is when the Church of the Anastasis in Jerusalem was built, right under Constantine. And that made it look a little bit different than, simply at home breaking the bread.
So would you say prior to that point, the legalization of Christianity, church and liturgy looked vastly different?
Yes.
Yeah. And then it only started, like the processes or the liturgical practices rather, they only started to be developed beyond that point.
I imagine that they still had a lot of liturgical practices early on. So they still had prayers that they would pray over the Eucharist. They would still have hymns that they might have sung.
Mm.
So we already have, actually, from the 1st century, we have an example of an anaphora, right, from the 1st century. We have a liturgy from a source called the Didache, and we know that this source was actually popular in Egypt. So Egyptians prayed this at some point in our history too.
Mm.
That's interesting. So would that have been, because obviously we are Gentiles, right? Would that have been liturgies that were prayed also at night, or did liturgies suddenly stop with the whole concept of the Passover happening at night? Did they start having those liturgies in the morning? Did Gentiles understand why they're having it at night? Was that ever, how it evolved from night liturgies to morning liturgies? How did that come about?
I don't know if we have much definitive answer in that regard, because it seems that things were celebrated differently across regions.
Mm.
So it's very hard to speak of a uniform practice, especially in the early days. Things were very diverse. Some people would have liturgies at night, some would have it in the morning, and we even have, from within Egypt, we have a reference in the 5th century, Shenouda the Archimandrite, already saying that the people in Alexandria, or I think it was Cairo, no, it must have been Alexandria actually, the people in Alexandria were celebrating liturgy later in the day still, because people wanted to celebrate after work. I imagine as monasticism grew, the synaxis of monks might have looked different. But
just for viewers, can we get some elaboration on synaxis, what that means?
So synaxis just means the liturgical gathering of people. So it could be for morning prayer, evening prayer, or the Eucharist itself.
Mm. Which touches on another question of mine. When we talk about liturgy, are we specifically talking about Eucharist, or even from the time of the apostles, did liturgy mean more than just the Eucharistic prayer?
I think it does mean more than the Eucharistic prayer, because originally liturgy was used to designate the worship of the temple in the Old Testament. So in the Septuagint, they use that word, so that the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, so the Old Testament. And they use this word liturgy to describe what the priests would do. And of course, at that point, it wasn't a Eucharist. The morning and evening work that they did was called liturgy. And so we use it now to mean, so Matins is a liturgy, and midnight praises is a liturgy. And of course, the Eucharist is liturgy. Sometimes you'll hear Eucharistic liturgy, so that would be specifying.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a bit about my childhood, right? And I always remember my parents. It was always a massive thing. We have to go Vespers. Vespers is an important thing. And I remember coming to church, and I don't know, Mark, if you remember as well, but church was, relatively packed. Everyone, we need to go to Vespers, because Vespers is where we prepare ourselves before the liturgy. Now, two questions. Should that be the mindset? So should I attend the Vespers to prepare myself before the liturgy, or should Vesper be just an organic way of life where it's a prayer, just like we pray the 11th hour or the 12th hour, and Matins being the morning prayer? So that's the first question. Second question, if that rite has slowly lost its importance or value from our perspective, what can we do? It's very important, right? So what can we do to revive this rite? Because it seems to be a liturgical practice.
So the interesting thing about Matins and Vespers is that they are not what they seem. So we tend to think of them today as preparation for the liturgy. So I think anybody that I've heard talk about the subject has said that Matins and Vespers are preparation for the Eucharist. When we go back to the early period, it turns out it's not actually the case. And these services were never related to the Eucharist in that they were preparation for it. It's something like, you go to dinner and then you go to bed. Does that mean that you're preparing to sleep by having dinner?
For me personally, is that a personal question?
No.
I don't know if you got the right analogy there.
Or the right audience.
I understand what you're trying to hint at, but wrong people to talk to.
No, but yeah, definitely.
Right, so
yes, I see it.
We do two things in tandem, and so we tend to associate them with each other. In reality, we had Matins. So Matins and Vespers are the prayer of the morning and the prayer of the evening. And so they're much more similar to the Akbeya first hour and 11th hour than they are to the Eucharist. The whole point of them is to pray at certain points during the day, the morning and the evening. And we had daily services of Matins and Vespers, and we can still have them actually. So you can have a Matins in the morning, and then you go home because there's no Eucharist on the day. So the day looked like for generally people, for Christians, is they would go to Matins, and then they would go to work, and then after work they'd go to Vespers. The fact that now we tend to strongly link them to the Eucharist, I think leads to us missing the point about them. So if you look at the prayers themselves, they actually never mention the Eucharist in Matins and Vespers.
Apart from maybe for Matins in the offering, or would that be
so the Matins, you're talking about the litany of
the oblations?
Of the oblations?
Yeah.
So that litany is actually only meant to be said if a Eucharist follows.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well,
if the Eucharist doesn't follow, another litany is meant to be said.
And it's only on Sundays or feast, major feast days. Feasts of the Lord.
Yes. On major feasts, you would do everything anyway, and so it looks like they're connected or like you're preparing, but it's not actually the case.
Okay. Buna, yeah, maybe.
Sorry, I might just correct me if I'm wrong, Nina, but I understand that in the monasteries they had the praying of the Psalms as morning and evening, and it was the cathedral services where they started the incense prayers, and what became our Matins and Vespers, and eventually sort of each leaked into the other place. But one thing I remember from Abuna Mina Namatallah way back in the day, who preserved a lot of things that are lost today, but he used to make a big deal about lighting the lamps when we would pray Vespers. And all the ladies would come and fill up the oil and, trim the wicks and everything. And I believe that goes back to the Old Testament, right, where they had the evening prayer and the morning prayer and then you would light the lamps, and that way the lamps would be on 24 hours, like all the way around. So it was as Mina's saying, it wasn't really connected to the Eucharist. It was kind of a prayer certainly in the Old Testament, a reminder of the presence of God with us, 24 hours a day.
This connection with the oil lamps was so strong in the early centuries that the service of Vespers was called the lighting of the lamps.
Oh,
Liknikon is the lighting of the lamps.
That's in the church, like the early church, that they named it.
4th century.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting.
And it's really because I think we don't really care when the sun sets anymore today, right? you can flick a switch and the light is on. Sometimes you don't even to do anything. You just walk into a room and the sensor is going to pick you up, and there you go, there's light.
Mhm.
Back then it was a ritual of sunset to go around and prepare for the night, and so you would go around and light all of the lamps that you have. And that's how the service was associated with the lighting of the lamps, because it's meant to be done at sunset. So you do the morning matins service at sunrise, and you light the lamps at sunset.
Abuna, it seems like there's so much significance to the service as a liturgical practice, and specifically matins and vespers, it needs to be prayed with a priest, right? There has to be a priest. Unlike midnight psalmody, for example, do we need a priest for midnight psalmody? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Currently, no.
Currently, no. Okay. So interested to know. So since we are speaking about the significance of matins and vespers, have they died out? From what are you seeing as a church, not necessarily our parish, but as a church, has it died out? How can we revive it?
I think it's definitely being prayed. It's not that it's not sort of being prayed, although we don't do it every day. We don't pray Vespers even when there's a Mass the next day, except for the Sunday liturgy. That's the only one. And I think you have to keep in mind that these are things that developed before the advent of cars and Ubers and trains, when everybody lived within a short walk of their church often. So it was a very lovely communal thing, right? That at the end of a day labouring in the fields, everyone would gather together in the church and they would pray, the Vespers prayer or whatever it might be. Of course, nowadays life is very, very different. I still think it is. I mean, it's a valuable opportunity to kind of not get carried away by the demands of modern life. It is a lovely opportunity to come, even if it's just on the Saturday evening, and to sit. I always feel that there's this special feeling about Saturday Vespers. It's a very peaceful sort of, that feeling you get when you've been really, really busy and you finish what you're doing, and that feeling you get when you finally kind of take your breath and sit down. I always feel that's sort of the spirit of Vespers. I don't know, maybe it's just me.
Maybe because it's sunset as well. It's usually around sunset, so it's like a time of reflection.
Yeah.
Just relaxing.
So that is a lovely thing. And I suppose nowadays there are all kinds of other services that gather round the Vespers prayers on a Saturday. Churches do activities for kids, Bible studies. I know in Melbourne, I believe Sunday school is held on a Saturday before Vespers. That's the standard thing. I don't know if they still do that now, but that was always their tradition. It wasn't on Sunday, it's on Saturday afternoon. But yeah, it's an opportunity, I think, for us to gather as a community together.
It's really nice. You have something to say, Mark?
It brings up so many questions, this conversation. I have a train of thought which requires a few questions, if you guys don't mind. So the first question, the foundational question is, what makes a prayer a liturgical prayer? Because we were talking about matins and vespers being liturgical prayers, and the Eucharist is one of them. What elements make up a liturgical prayer?
Going back to the definition, I guess, of liturgy.
Yeah, I suppose there's two ways to answer it, in the sense that if you think of liturgy as simply a group of people, then almost anything can be a liturgical prayer. I think as well, at the same time, you have the narrower definition of things that are kind of printed in a book, right, or ready for somebody to pray.
The reason I ask that question is because I think, I don't know if it's just my upbringing or if the church has emphasized some kind of importance on liturgical prayer. I mean, certainly the Eucharist is the cornerstone of the way that we worship God. But yeah, there seems to be, I don't know, some kind of cultural importance to attending the liturgy within the Coptic kind of community. And in my mind, I tend to kind of separate prayers that happen at church as liturgical prayers, and prayers at home as personal prayers, even if it's with a group of people or whatever. And so there tends to be this kind of formality attached to liturgical prayers. Would you say that that's kind of a correct way of approaching this term, liturgy?
I think if you think about so let's say you're praying with a group of people at somebody's home, isn't this a lot more like the Last Supper and the early Christian worship? So they were certainly doing liturgy back then, and at the time you're doing this, you're also doing liturgy. You're not a church, you might be using different prayers, but it's still liturgical worship in that sense.
And as Shakespeare said, what's in a name? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. The important thing is you're praying together communally. Whether you call it liturgy or don't call it liturgy is probably a lesser question. I don't know, maybe that's a bit heretical. But
No, well, I think part of my question is also like, is there a hierarchy in terms of, like prayers that we engage in? Like we've been told growing up, the liturgy and baptism and obviously confession and the chrismation, they're the standard things that every Christian has to do. They're kind of the highest call for Coptic Orthodox anyway. And then it seems as though matins and vespers and midnight praise is still quite formal and important,
like
because
secondary.
It happens. Yeah,
like
because it happens in
yeah.
churches, and a priest accompanies those prayers. But yeah, somewhat secondary or in preparation. I know you've dispelled this myth already, but the idea was that it was in preparation for the Eucharistic liturgy. And then like the personal prayers tend to be still very important for us to do, but somewhat less formal, so to speak, unless you're like opening an agbeya. So the act of opening a book makes it somewhat more formal. Is that a helpful way of thinking of the types of prayers that we have in our church, or do you have any kind of comment on that?
I think we are very fortunate to have a liturgical history such as ours, where we have so much abundance and richness in terms of the types of prayer, the types of hymns that are available to you. Even if you're at home by yourself, you can still pick up an agbeya and pray, and there's always the opportunity to join fellow believers in church. So I think that's richness that our tradition has.
There doesn't necessarily need to be rules or prescriptions. This is just all gems, and the more we engage with them, the more they purify us, I guess.
We have a lot of deep questions, all right? But I want to ask this question. It's a burning question. It's a question from a female, okay? Sometimes there is a bit of a disconnect where females can feel, why do the guys get to be deacons and have all these beautiful services in the liturgy? I would like to hold a candle. I would like to sing. What is your stance, Abuna and Mina, on females eventually being able to chant with the deacons? I know, Abuna, that we do have in our own sister churches in the Oriental Orthodox Church, there is deaconesses. Culturally speaking, what is stopping the Coptic Church from doing that? Have some churches already done that? So interested to hear more about this topic, because I'm sure it will be very interesting for a lot of girls.
And hopefully interesting for the boys as well. Yeah, look, you're quite right. The fact is that many of our sister Oriental Orthodox churches, in fact all of them as far as I can tell,
Wow.
at the very least have female choirs in the liturgy. And this is not something new that came about as politically correct. Saint Ephrem the Syrian, back in the 4th century, I think, had his own travelling choir of females who prayed the liturgy, led the congregation in responding to the liturgy wherever he prayed. I've never been able to understand why that hasn't been the case in the Coptic Church. The little digging that I've done has revealed that back in the early 20th century, there were a couple of attempts to introduce, Mina would know about this, to introduce female choirs that were quickly snuffed out. And again, I don't know what motivated them. This is in Cairo, right? Whether it's interaction with other Orthodox who have female choirs, I don't know what it is. I have a folder on my laptop where I've been collecting photos of female choirs from all the different Orthodox and Eastern churches generally. I now have over 100, I think, something like that I've found.
We'd love to share that, Abuna.
And they all dress up in their own particular traditions, whatever, and they stand in different places. Some of them have male and female, some of them just have the females, and so on. So it's a very widespread practice. It's already happening in the Coptic Church. It's been happening in Los Angeles for a number of years now. It's happening in, I'm almost ashamed to say this, although I shouldn't be ashamed, Upper Egypt, Said, the place which is generally thought of as being, the least forward-thinking part of Egypt. They have female choirs, and here we are in countries like Australia and America and England, still squabbling and arguing over this. It is very weird. Many of our sister Oriental churches have female readers. I've attended services, liturgies, and marriages where women get up and read the readings. Ultimately, reading and chanting are not priestly roles. Even in our Coptic tradition, the 7 ranks of the priesthood do not include the reader and the chanter. They stop with the subdeacon. So these are just very simple, practical roles, ways of facilitating the worship of the congregation. And every parish should be able to do it in whatever way works best for their particular needs. And
can I ask Abuna, sorry, on the point of Upper Egypt? This is it's quite a shock, but I want to ask, has the synod or the church as a whole made a comment on that, like supported or rejected, or like has anything happened?
Yes, so there was a statement from the synod banning female choirs. Can't remember, 5, 6, maybe 10 years ago, something like that. This was when they were just starting to sprout in the Coptic Church. Very, very traditionalist people. I'm not saying traditional, because people who actually understand tradition understand that this is the Orthodox tradition. But I use the ist on the end. People who kind of want to use tradition to make a point rather than bowing to the tradition, if I can put it that way. And I don't know the story of why the synod made that rule, but, as they say, it's been observed more in the breach than in the exercise. Basically, a lot of churches have just kept going, and we haven't heard anything after that from the Holy Synod.
And what is it about that point, Abuna, like that specific point? What is it that it's such a big point of contention in our church? Like, from your experience, what are you seeing that is making it such a big deal?
I could only speculate, and my speculations are nothing more than that. But look, I wonder if the Islamic environment in Egypt plays a role, but then the Syriac church is also in an Islamic environment, and they've always had women readers and chanters. So I don't think that can be the whole story. Maybe the the relationship between Christians and Muslims is different in Egypt because we are a small minority. we often feel that we mustn't do anything to bring condemnation on ourselves from the Muslim majority. Whereas I think that's a little bit more equal in a place like Syria. I'm not sure. I could be wrong about that. I also think change is just difficult for people because we haven't been doing it for the last 50, 100 years. For us, it's actually probably a lot longer than that. When you say we want to do something we haven't done before, people are always very cautious. And I can understand that. But I think, caution can also be taken too far and it can become damaging.
Yeah, interesting. I'm still stumped about the Upper Egypt churches.
I mean, to add actually to the list, there is also the church in Maadi, Cairo, that have been doing something similar. So they still have the chanters, the men, they'll stand up here, and the women are still standing down, but they actually alternate. So I've listened to a lot of hymns where they alternate, and even the hymns lessen everybody's attending. It's not just the men.
And we must remember, the very idea of a liturgical choir is something of a novelty in the Coptic tradition, isn't it? Because, for many centuries, we just had the muallim, the blind man, who didn't even wear a tunya or anything. And all he did is lead everybody in singing, men and women.
I think this is actually key because we, I think, have a certain challenge now in that we call everybody deacons when they're really not. So
the concept of ranking, yeah.
So we have a challenge to solve with all of these diaconal roles that currently don't really mean anything. So whether you're a chanter or a reader or a subdeacon or a deacon, everybody is doing what everybody else is doing, right? So the roles have no meaning in and of themselves at the moment. And because most men tend to be ordained, even from a very young age, and we get to call them deacon, right? But in fact, the young boy is just a chanter, right? Just as Abuna said, originally it was just a muallim who is not wearing a tunya, he's not ordained to anything, he's just one of the people who knows the hymns well. And so if it's just one person from the people who can lead, it can be anybody because they're not ordained.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I think it's probably, we're a very generous church, so we want to give everyone the chance to share in everything. But we lose the meaning. You're right, as you said, it becomes a bit of an issue.
Just to generalize this discussion a little bit, what is your advice to any congregation member really that is feeling somewhat that the liturgy is not relatable or isn't really connecting with, and I mean the Eucharistic liturgy specifically, but obviously any liturgical prayer. Because I think something I come across with, I want to say with youth predominantly, is that the liturgy sometimes seems, I guess, a little old-fashioned, a little long, a little bit inconvenient. The importance of it might not be understood as much, and not knowing all the rites and the hymns and all that kind of stuff does present a huge barrier to someone connecting with the liturgy. So what's your kind of general advice to someone who struggles to...
Well, I think most importantly, I would say, is to get back to the basics and remember what it is we are doing in any kind of liturgy. I sometimes have the experience when we do a baptism, where you guys have attended this, I think, right? Where I stop and explain, this is what this means, this is why we do this, and so on. Every time I do that, people come up to me afterwards and say, Abuna, we never knew this. Thank you for telling us. It actually made so much more sense to us. I don't think it's practical to expect that you're just going to walk in off the street, not having invested any time or effort at all into understanding what you're walking into, and expect to have this beautiful, transcendent spiritual experience. Right? How's that going to happen? How are you going to read a book if you don't know how to read? right? But once you learn to read, it opens up a door to an unending and infinite space of beauty and divinity and transcending our life and stepping out of the humdrum and the worries and the burdens of our daily life, stepping into eternity in a way. It needs the effort, so you've got to put the effort in. You've got to understand, and thankfully we live in an age where there are books that help you to understand this. You can go and study at St. Cyril's College and learn about it. You can listen to podcasts about it, right? We really have no excuse these days. I think, unfortunately, parents, when they're introducing their kids to liturgy, often expect them to not enjoy it. I don't know. Sometimes I feel it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like, of course, my kid's not going to enjoy it. But no, I mean, I would encourage parents to make liturgy fun, make it an enjoyable experience. They may not be able to know what's going on yet, but let them, make up a game about smelling the incense, give them a quiz on the icons around the place, tell them to, let them know when Abuna walks past with the censer, or even just give them something to, do that is enjoyable at the time, just so they have that positive experience. And as they grow, take them home, sit them on your knee. What did you see today? Did you see when Abuna did this? Do you know what that means? And gradually make it an organic experience for them, that it becomes part of their life. If you're an adult already and you didn't get to have all that sort of done for you, then go and do your own research. It's worth it. What is more important, I would ask? Is there anything in life more important than making that connection with Christ and with heaven? If we don't do that, do we really think that, when the last day of our life comes, suddenly we will feel at home in heaven, when we've missed every opportunity to discover it while we were on earth because we didn't really want it?
I think I would enjoy that game more than the little kid. The kids, that sounds too interesting.
It could apply to grown-ups too.
Yes, I think let's apply it tomorrow on Sunday liturgy.
Can I just be challenging and push back on one area? So the presupposition is that the liturgy is the most important way to connect with God, because then someone could say, well, why do I need the liturgy to connect with God? I agree with the importance of connecting with God in my life, but why the liturgy?
Do you want to go?
No.
I'm gonna go hard on this one. Yes, it is. It is the center of our lives as Christians, certainly as Orthodox Christians. But it doesn't just happen in a couple of hours on Sunday. It in fact should be our whole lives. There should be no clear and distinct border between my connection with God in church with the body of Christ on the altar and my connection with God when I walk out of the doors of church and I carry that body and blood of Christ on the altar of my heart. They should be the same, one and the same event.
It's beautiful.
So not bound by the 2 hours, not bound by the premises of the church.
Exactly. And sure, I could stay home and pray. I could get my loaf of sliced bread and eat with thanks. I don't know, some grape juice or something. I could do that. But then I'm separating myself from the body of Christ, which is you and me and all of us. I need to come and be among other Christians because they're the ones who are going to annoy me so that I can forgive them. Pull me up when I've done something wrong so that I can see things that I didn't see for myself. Give me opportunities to practice kindness and self-sacrifice. Right? What is it? Tertullian, I think, was the one who said, one Christian is no Christian. Like you literally cannot be a Christian by yourself.
No
because
fellowship. Yeah.
Christianity is the faith that centers on love. And if you are alone, how are you going to practice that love in the world? We need to practice that love. As St. John said, how can you say you love the Father whom you can't see when you don't love your brother who you can see. We have to practice that, and that's what church gives us the opportunity to do.
It's interesting that you bring that up, Mark, as well, because like when you come to church, sometimes there's always the conversation, well, liturgy or Bible, right? There's always the conversation, what came first, or what's more important. When you look at liturgy, we're considering Vespers as a liturgical practice. You've got Psalm and Gospel there, right? Matins, you've got your Psalm and Gospel there. Midnight Psalmody, it's all the Psalms, right? So I would really, sometimes it surprises me when that question arises to, why do I need liturgy? I've got the Bible at home. Or, well, yeah, you've got the Bible here with practicing love amongst your brothers and sisters. So,
interestingly, what you just said about Vespers having a reading from the Gospel is something that is one of the things that distinguishes Egyptian practices in particular in the early days. So right now, it's not actually the case. So in the Byzantine Rite, not all Matins and Vespers have Gospel readings.
there you go.
Right?
Wow.
Do they have a reading, just not the Gospel, or no readings at all?
No, some services don't have reading at all.
So just prayers, like litanies?
Yes, litanies and prayers and hymns.
Yeah.
But in Egypt, from very early on, 4th century, it was always the case that there's a Gospel reading, morning and evening.
Wow.
Is that why in a lot of our services there seems to be a gospel reading or a Pauline reading or something?
It's hard to find a service that doesn't have.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I often thought, because sometimes we don't, we haven't always practiced the service the way that it's been written in Coptic Reader as it is at the moment, but like it seemed like the reading had come out of nowhere. I'll give you an example. So in a few of the hours, I believe like first and third hour of Good Friday, some rites say that there is a gospel, some rites say there isn't. That's just an example of a service where it seems like a gospel reading has come out of nowhere.
I think it's the Pauline epistle you're thinking.
Yes, it is the Pauline.
Not the
Sorry.
gospel, yeah.
Yes. There is, of course, a gospel. But yeah, it seems like a reading has just come out of nowhere. But yeah, it's interesting you say it's an Alexandrian tradition, because it kind of makes sense now that all the readings seem to be popping up in these services now that we have, scholarship that's kind of researching these things, and books that are more, they're in English, for example, and more accessible to us.
So the Alexandrians were the original evangelicals. There you go.
There you go. So,
one more point actually, when you reminded me when you were saying how there shouldn't really be separation between the time we spend in liturgy and the time outside. Again, in the early centuries, in the 4th century, Egypt was the home of monasticism, right? So this was
we have a lot of questions
movement
coming up
started.
from monasticism, actually.
And we have an example of somebody who traveled from Gaul, so this is near France, John Cassian, who spent 20 years in Sketes, Wadi Natrun, learning monasticism from monks. He saw that they were praying only 2 times a day, morning and evening. He wrote about what he saw in the desert there to a community, his own community, that was already praying multiple times during the day. And he said, these Egyptian monks, they are praying less times than we do, only morning and evening, and yet their prayer is better than ours because they spent the entire day prayer. They spend the entire day in prayer anyway. So as they leave the morning service, they're still praying. As they go into the evening prayer, it's not that they're starting something that they weren't already doing. So there's this idea of a continuous motion going through the day rather than discrete times of prayer during the day.
And what was he observing that was different, that wasn't practiced by the Egyptian monks? How did they pray?
The Egyptian monks resisted for some time the additional hours, the 3rd, 6th, 9th, and so on, that we have in our Akber now. they were in the 4th century praying just the morning and evening. That's it.
Right. England, yeah. Did you want to say?
I was just going to add, I'm sure there's at least a small element of charity on John Cassian's part.
Certainly.
But it is interesting to see that even in those early centuries, there were people from vastly different geographies, traveling to different churches to experience their Christianity and so on. And perhaps maybe if there was more of that in today's day and age, might be a more charitable place. But
Question. So Alexandrian Church, 3 liturgies that we have: Saint Basil, Saint Gregory, who was a very good friend of Saint Basil and his family, and Saint Basil's brother was also Saint Gregory, but of Nyssa. Such a blessed family. But we have the liturgy of Saint Cyril, which is originally Saint Mark's liturgy. Although any liturgy that I hear on SoundCloud or YouTube or any liturgy that we pray in our church, more often than not we pray the Saint Basil's liturgy. How did that happen? And would love to. I know Saint Cyril's liturgy is very poetic. Is it in the interest of time that we choose Saint Basil? Is there a depth? Is there a reason why we left our Alexandrian liturgy from Saint Mark? We don't pray it as often. Any historical context to that?
So just for the listeners, the liturgy of Saint Mark or Saint Cyril's is the only Egyptian liturgy.
Yes.
Right? So the liturgies of Basil and Gregory were not written in Egypt. Yeah. Would you like to say something?
No,
So
here you go.
I'll try and be just brief about how this happened, but we have no other place than Egypt that has seen so many diverse range of anaphoras. So even up to the 11th century, we have in Upper Egypt documents showing that they had the option to choose between 12 to 13 different anaphoras.
Sorry, the anaphora being the main part of the Eucharistic prayer.
Yes, so anaphora is just, liturgy of somebody. And so the liturgy of Mark is not only the only Egyptian liturgy that we currently preserve, but it's also the earliest in terms of when the Egyptians celebrated it. So it was that liturgy that's the Egyptian, and then it seems to be the case that both Basil and Gregory came through Egypt after Chalcedon, after the Syrians sort of joined forces with the Egyptians as they reject Chalcedon, and there was a lot of liturgical exchange happening at the time. After this happened, it appears that Egyptians in the north, so the Alexandrians, preferred Basil for some reason that is still unclear. So we know that because as early as our Euchologia go, so a Euchologion is the book that has all of the liturgies, the Cholegi. They tend to start with Basil at the beginning, just like our books today, right? And that tells us that from very early on, they seem to have prioritized Basil naturally, right, organically. No one really mandated this or anything like that. But people seem to have preferred Basil for some reason. And it's unclear whether that is, why that is.
Well, I read somewhere there was something like 60 liturgies at a point, and then it was narrowed down to the 3, St. Basil, Gregory, and Cyril. What I read was around 11th century. That's when we only had 3. But no, I think Mark, you were mentioning, I think it came a bit later.
I wasn't sure. That was something that we were going to ask.
No, yeah, like by the 12th century, we know that Basil, Gregory, and Mark were the 3 liturgies. At least, so this is actually only for the northern Egypt, right? Southern Egypt is a different story.
Okay.
I may be getting this wrong, but I remember reading somewhere that as late as like the 18th or 19th century, there was evidence in Upper Egypt of them praying different liturgies from those three.
Maybe.
I know of, so there is one famous recording that I know of, which is a Coptic priest praying the anaphora of Saint John, Son of Thunder, attributed to Saint John, Son of Thunder. But it's widely known as the Habashi Mass or the Habashi Liturgy, and I think that's because it's predominantly preserved by the Ethiopians. Is that right?
I'm not sure which particular recording you're referring to, but yes, in the sense that a lot of Egyptian liturgies were preserved by the Ethiopian Church. Because the Ethiopian Church in the beginning was practically a diocese of the Alexandrian Patriarchate. And the bishop that would oversee Ethiopia was almost always an Alexandrian bishop. And so a lot of Egyptian traditions made their way into Ethiopia, and sometimes they did a better job at preserving some things than we did.
So they have more than 3.
They still have 13, 14 different anaphoras. Yeah. They were translated into Arabic some 40, 50 years ago, I think. Someone trying to bring them into light again to the Copts.
There is an English document as well that I've discovered
containing the 1340.
So on this topic of different liturgies, every liturgy has a very rich rite. Okay, we have amazing rites in the church. You can probably see where I'm going with this. We love our rites very, very much.
Right and proper.
Right and worthy, or meet and right. But yeah, I wanted to ask, there's always questions around why do we do this, and we don't know, right? The church is very rich, and you were just telling us, Mina, before the podcast about the gospel responses, how they had gospel responses for every Sunday, 52 Sundays with different responses. Bizarre, something so like brand new, never heard anything like this. So many times we ask the question of why, we get an answer. We don't know, is this the reason or is this a contemplation, right? Where do we draw that line, right? Because it's important to understand sometimes the deacon holds the candle in front of the body of Christ, right? I always used to, it's as if, no, we need to turn the congregation's attention to the body. But then I heard they just didn't have light back then, so we just needed a candle. This is just a silly example, but just want to know from you some input on why, where do we draw that line?
And is there a difference between authoritative, explanation to the ritual, so the reason why we do things this way, and a contemplation? Is there any difference?
So to start off, the idea of having contemplations on things that we practice constantly is something I think that's very human and to be expected, right? We want to draw meaning and see patterns of things that might look monotonous, and we see them every week, and we like to draw these connections to enrich what we do. So that's completely fine. They are one category of explanations, right? They don't really explain anything. They just draw links to what you do to something else, right? So we do this because Christ did this, or we do this because we remind ourselves of something else. The difference between these kinds of categories and the other category is that these kind of contemplations are not the original reason why we do these things.
But sometimes the original reason is not very clear as well. So
that's true, of course. Almost always the original reason something is done for practical purposes.
Okay, so you're differentiating between the explanation to the rite and a random person's contemplation by saying the explanation was always just originally this was done for this reason.
Yes.
And you gave the example earlier where you said, back in the day before electricity, they used to light lamps at night because sunset was like a big deal, it was a huge change. So kind of came down to that practical issue. Whereas in today's day and age, that tends to go over our heads because we've got light 24/7.
Yeah, so the contemplations, you can have as many as you want. You can have as varying explanations as you want. I don't really like to call them explanations because they don't really explain. But the original reason something is done, there's always one reason. It might not be known sometimes, and there might be competing hypotheses, but there's only one reason why something originated to begin with. And then after that's put in place, people start drawing connections and seeing parallels.
In that case, look, I may be using the term right in a few different senses here, but in that case, would you then say that the right is not in and of itself important to stick to, like, to the letter? Because at the end of the day, these things came about because originally, they had a different environment and they used to light candles, for example. Whereas nowadays there's no need for candles. So maybe that's something that's not necessary anymore. So in that sense, can the rite be changed over time? Is there any issue with that?
Right? Can we keep candles? Change other rites.
I'm just over the melting wax. every child has to go through that.
Yes.
And nearly burning down the church because
Yes.
they're not focused.
Yeah, and they burn their hair. I've burnt my hair before.
Yeah.
I've done that too.
Yeah, I think you're very right about this. Like, you've touched on something very important, which is that the rite is a means to an end. Right? It's never the rite itself that's the purpose. The purpose is prayer and communion with God, and that happens through, us, let's say, organizing some kind of system where everybody knows what to say and when, for the benefit of the people. And anybody who's looked at the evolution of these rites will know that things change all the time. Like today we have the internet, we have video recording, and we have the printing press, of course. So we have the idea of printed books, right? So everybody around the world has the same book containing the same material. And all of that gives you the illusion that we have a single rite. There is the rite of the Coptic Orthodox Church, right? In reality, when you look back, you see a lot of diversity that's happening. The people in Cairo are doing one thing, the people of Alexandria doing one thing, people in monasteries doing another thing. And when we see writers, our own Coptic writers, writing about these differences in practice, they never really treat it as a problem to be solved. They never treat it as there's a challenge here that there are differing practices. They are not embarrassed at all to say and list these different practices. And I think now a lot of this is coming to light, actually, in that we've seen multiple musical traditions of hymns. Like you can see one hymn with 3-4 different tunes to them, coming from different parts of Egypt. So this was the case with practices themselves too. It's something that enriches our church and not something that needs to be solved, right?
Abuni, I know you have something interesting about rites.
No, I was just going to say, it's also, I think, following on from what Mina's saying, to remember that the language of the liturgy is poetry and not prose, right? I mean, if you want to write a scientific textbook about how bacteria grow, right? There's only going to be like one right way to do it. There's only, one right set of facts that you can set forward. And if you make stuff up, then you're doing something terrible. You're saying, you're lying. That's not what we're doing in the liturgy. The liturgy, we're not coming to the liturgy to be told, there is one God who is a Trinity and whatever. If that was the case, we'd only ever need to come to the liturgy once in our life and we'd get it, and that's it. Why come again, right? But that's not what it is. We're coming to enter into a world. It's like jumping into an ocean and swimming, and seeing how far you can get. And that's the language of poetry. What poetry does is it sort of sows the seed that you then take, and every different person makes it grow into something different, of a different shape, of a different color. And every time I come into the liturgy, I'm a different person. So what I make from it, from the same seed, is going to be different every time that I come. Right? That's really what we're talking about. And that's why, if it was the scientific textbook model, then yeah, we shouldn't touch the rites, right? You don't change things. But if it's the sort of seed growing model, then yeah, of course it's going to, things are going to change, and that's okay. It's poetry. It's not that rigid.
Could I just mention a challenging question? So then,
Mark's challenging us a lot today.
not really. We spoke about a few innovations, or not innovations, that's probably a wrong word, but like, for example, the female choir, something that disappeared from our tradition. We're exploring potentially.
We may never have had it. I don't know if it was ever in the Coptic tradition, but it was certainly in other ones. Sorry, picky point.
No, that's okay. Just as an example, right? So somewhere that potentially we're exploring the right, going towards. Where do we draw the line between a helpful change and no, this is too far? Like, we're trying to innovate too much. So if I can draw your attention to a few things, to, for example, music and hymnology, a lot of it is very difficult and very old and very slow and long. All negative descriptions. Even though I love the liturgy, the hymnology myself, that's the type of thing that someone disconnected with the liturgy says often. So the hymnology, the fact that it's 2-3 hours long, like, why do we have to say all these prayers? Some may see it as repetitive. Oftentimes we omit certain parts of the liturgy, if I could say that.
We do.
Yeah.
Not omit.
We don't omit
like,
them, but they might be prayed silently or something. I can't think of anything we actually omit. I could be wrong. Or maybe there are bits we omit.
I have
every
one
Sunday.
small example
Yeah.
of an omission. So we have a shortened version of the commemoration of the saints sometimes, which a priest may choose to say.
I mean, you can probably never run out of saints if you do more.
That is true. It's not a significant omission in my own personal opinion, but it's an example of an omission.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Most often it's something that happens silently. So I'm sorry, I'm rambling. Back to the original question. When does a change kind of cross the line?
That's a good question for Mina to answer.
Sorry, Mina.
I don't know if there is a clear answer, because this is something that requires... So actually, first of all, a lot of what you're describing in terms of how to assess a particular thing, whether it's positive or negative, understanding the historical context and how our liturgy is developed can help a lot. Right? So something like female choirs, when you look back, you see, okay, there wasn't a dedicated female choir, but at the same time, there weren't really the idea of the people are observers, right? Actually, even in our books today, you see, the people chant this. It's not the deacon that's chanting. Whenever our books refer to deacon, they refer to the deacon serving inside at the altar. And so this is something that understanding the history can help us, right? So going back to where it all started, you can see these trends, and this can aid in saying, okay, this is in line with, let's say, the original direction that liturgy was going. So this is one thing. So understanding our own tradition. And the other thing, which actually you also mentioned, is understanding other Christian traditions. So if people want to look at, let's say, how a particular, the topic of funerals during Holy Week, right? Currently, we don't have any funerals during Holy Week in the Coptic Church. What do other churches do? Right? So let's say the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russians, the Catholics. Do they do funerals? And if they do, how do they manage, let's say, Paschal services with the funerals? So doing this kind of comparative study can really help in informing us, what direction can we take things in that might benefit the people at the end of the day. So I think really that's the primary aim of all of this, is what is going to benefit the people. And at the same time, so we have a difficulty now is that we have very little attention spans. And unfortunately, the social media and the technology, as useful as it is, also comes at the price of, I think, young people. Nobody reads anymore, it seems. Nobody has the patience even to watch something that long.
ChatGPT.
Right?
It's how we have these questions, by the way.
That's a new
I'm joking.
ballgame.
There's a lot of
So,
yeah.
benefiting the people, but not in indulging their laziness. Right? We want to get them away from this idea of everything needs to be very quick. Everything needs to be, swipe, next. I'm bored of this content. Give me the next thing. I think this is a real problem.
That devalues really what the liturgy is about. Can I just throw in, someone said to me once, to be radical, you must first be traditional. Otherwise, it's just vandalism. Right? This sort of, there is sometimes this attitude of, we just got to change things, right? Because, we don't have attention spans or whatever. Change this, change that. But if you don't first invest the time and effort in understanding the tradition, then you risk losing the heart of what it's about. With your, it is vandalism. It's just destruction. But if you have understood the tradition, then you can find new ways to express that changeless tradition in different new expressions, if that makes sense.
I want to touch on a bit of a different point. Mark, you spoke about hymnology. You love hymnology. We know that. I love hymnology. I think our hymns are very rich in their meaning. I want to speak a bit about the midnight psalm, right? And the midnight tasbih as a liturgical practice, it's been going on for so long, right? Like, there is a quote by St. Augustine. He goes that a love of psalmody gave birth to monasticism in the 4th century. So that love of psalms and tasbih, there is so much richness in there. What are we doing to try and revive something like this service? I feel over the years it hasn't been as it's kind of dropping off. Because on that note, what Mark was saying with the attention spans and that love for hymnology, yes, it can sound as it's too old, it's backdated, it's these are common phrases that we hear. So what can we do for how can we revive the love for midnight praises?
I see a lot of parishes now have midweek midnight praises where people come along, and often they sing a lot of it in English, which I think helps because the meaning of the words is really important and often I think gets forgotten. I see often they sing antiphonically, one side responds the other side, which is traditional, but they have females on one side, male voices on the other side, which is often a really beautiful thing. I'm seeing an increasing number of people who are incorporating psalmody into their private prayers at home, which I think is beautiful. As far as I know, the Agbeya psalms were never meant to be read out. They were meant to be sung. They were meant to be chanted. I'm not sure if I've got that right. Again, I can't remember where I read this, but somewhere I read that maybe it was in the time of John Cassian. The way they would pray is they would have all the monks sitting on the ground in the church, and then one monk would get up and say 3 psalms, and with meaning and with expression, and the others are sitting there reflecting and contemplating and digesting that meaning, turning it into their own plant and all that sort of stuff. There's no reason I think that's a good way to do it at home. I was just thinking when you were saying about our short attention spans and social media grabs our attention and so on. I mean, we're not going to introduce algorithms into our rites, that somehow, change the prayers to make sure that they keep your attention or something like that.
That's what we're missing.
But I feel like that would actually be to completely miss the point. The point is not for, the prayers to kind of pander to me. When I come into church, I'm actually coming in to bow my head before the Word of God and to open my heart to it and to let it come in and do its work. So I feel that the more that we have those things like the midweek tasbihas where, people are coming because they want to be there and they have a beautiful spiritual experience, I think that's how it grows. And word of mouth spreads it. I really don't know any other way to do it. I don't know if you have any ideas, Mina.
I know, I've seen so many references, even from church fathers, like Saint Athanasius going back 4th century, saying soldiers were storming in the church in Saint Theonas Church in Alexandria. I think that was where I read it, because they were storming the church to arrest Christians, and he said to the deacon, keep singing Psalm 135, which is the second horse. I'm not sure if you've read that reference in the past. So very interesting, right? Like from the 4th century, second horse was there as something they sing in the church. Is this a Coptic, just started with the Coptic Church, or even the universal Greek language in Alexandria? It would have been universal in other churches even after Chalcedon.
Yeah, certainly universal, because the basic idea is there's a group of texts in the Bible, and they're called odes or canticles, and they're basically prayers or hymns that somebody in the Bible has sung. And so from very early on, Jews and Christians would take these hymns and they would sing them again, so essentially joining in the people who have said this originally and joining their voice to theirs. So it was a very old practice, and that's why, let's say, Daniel 3 or the third horse is one of the things we sing, right? This is the hymn that they sung in the furnace. Or Exodus 15, the first horse, right?
That's all biblical.
Yes.
And I think we sing most of them in the Apocalypse Vigil, don't we? We have ode after ode after ode as part of the before Easter.
Yeah, all of these were actually meant to be sung.
Bruno, this is a question for you. Mark, did you have anything? I just had a couple of pastoral questions.
No.
There's a few questions. We wanted to speak more about engaging congregation in the liturgy, right? And I think the point we bring up about attention span, I think it's a massive thing, right? Like, even in Sunday school, like, you notice a lot of students, they just walk in, walk out, AirPod in, just difficulty to focus. It's very clear. And even in schools, like, it's the same issue, right? So that idea of disconnection from the liturgy, how can we attack that? How can we help the youth, reconnect again?
Look, I feel it's about what Mina was talking about before, about the fact that the congregation are not an audience to the liturgy, but they are participants in the liturgy. It's so much easier to lose focus if you're just audience, right? But if you're actually doing something and, you're playing a part where others are relying on you, that's a really good way to keep yourself focused. I think what we can do is encourage congregation participation. It's right there on the label, liturgy, the work of the people, right? In our Coptic tradition, I'm not allowed to pray a Eucharistic prayer by myself. I'm literally not allowed. There must be 3 people at least in the church, because it's got to be the people. It's not just a personal prayer. So if we can get that spirit back, and I think, that's a whole topic in itself. What do we do to get that spirit back of everybody participating? And there's probably not just one answer to that. It probably involves education, learning the hymns, learning the meanings and the symbolism and connections to the scripture and all that stuff. It probably involves what the choir does. It may involve taking away microphones from the choir so that people's voices can be, they can hear themselves when they sing. That's a controversial one, I know. I don't know. Maybe, I think there's a lot of space here. This is one of those areas where if you've understood what the tradition is about, that this is the prayer that everybody prays together, once you've understood that tradition, you can now start to be a little bit radical and say, what things can we do to get everybody praying together? And that won't be vandalism. That really will be reinforcing and re-embodying the tradition for our own times.
Okay, if I can make it a bit personal, to your opinion, Abuna, what's one habit or one practice in the liturgy that you would advocate to quietly kind of stop doing or maybe change, and something that you'd introduce perhaps?
Apart from the microphones, Abuna, I know you always.
I was going to go for that one. Can I have that one?
Sorry, Abuna, this one's taken.
That's kind of what I was hinting at. But
microphones are a modern problem, aren't they? We didn't have them 100 years ago.
I think they create more harm than good sometimes.
Yeah. Oh, look, they're probably morally neutral, but, it's how you use them. That's a tough question, Mark. Look, definitely what would I like to introduce? I would love to have that, male-female voice singing in response to each other. I think that's beautiful. In our own parish, we see it now. It's normal in Passion Week. And it's so beautiful. And everybody says, I wish that spirit could continue, after Easter. That'd be a small thing that we could do. What would I take away? I can't really think of anything that I want to take away. I don't know. Mina, do you have something you think you'd want to? You look like you do.
I suppose not really take away, but this is interesting because I've noticed with myself, now that we have screens everywhere, every church has screens, and the readings are there up on the screen as well. I've noticed with myself, if I'm reading the words on the screen, it seems that I don't really capture much. My eyes are following the words, I understand the words,
Missing out on the experience.
I don't really retain much. I looked into this further. It appears actually that somebody did a study on this, and they asked a group of students, do you prefer learning information by reading or by hearing? And the people who said they learn better by reading, when they actually tested them, it turns out they actually do better in hearing.
Wow.
Right. So, not really take away. I suppose there is a practical aspect to screens and so on. If you are like me and you find that if you're reading on the screen you don't really get much, try and actually not look at the screen and just listen. The fact that you just listen means that you're disconnecting from how we regularly consume information, which is in front of a screen scrolling, unfortunately. So when you just turn that off and you just listen, your brain switches on.
That assumes, of course, that the readers are reading well.
Yes.
And that's another thing I'd like to add. I think we need better training for reading.
I really think we need some structure to the diaconal roles. If you look at our own tradition and how strict they were about readers, for example, it must be someone that reads well. It has nothing to do with age as such. Like I know a 12-year-old that reads fantastically. Like, this person should be a reader. there is an interesting account of how if a reader were to be ordained, they were to go to the bishop and they would read something in front of the bishop, and the bishop will assess, did he read well, and if so, he would ordain him. So there used to be a very strict guideline as to whether you could be a reader or not.
Well, that's a lot of pressure. That's a lot of pressure for that deacon when you stand in front of the bishop and read.
He's going to stand in front of 300 people, so he's got to get used to
I'll
it.
be stuttering non-stop.
And I assume as well, it's not a matter of common literacy. Like anyone can read, I guess, to themselves, but it's a different kind of. It's different when you're talking about reading to a congregation, trying to kind of really emphasize the meaning behind the words. Yeah.
Okay. I think, Buna, we are very close to the end, but we usually
could keep going forever.
Definitely we could keep going. It's such a rich topic. But we usually we want to have a practice with the podcast where we ask a question about a rite, just an explanation, and then a follow-up question of something that you learned recently from the liturgy to share, something that not many people may know. So a question about the rite. So when the priest goes around the church with the censer, is there a specific prayer that you pray? That's the first question. And does this prayer change, especially in the middle aisle? So that's the question about the rite. And then there's a follow-up question.
Yes, there's a whole set of prayers that are prayed from the moment that the priest takes the censer and puts the spoons of incense in, and then he prays certain litanies as he walks around. The deacon is meant to respond, and then there's a prayer in front of the altar in the four directions, and then there's a prayer that changes depending on whether it's Vespers or Matins or the liturgy, as basically just greeting the saints kind of thing. Or if it's the Pauline epistle, he goes and says the blessing of the Pauline epistle be upon you and things like that. Then there's this lovely commemoration of the cross in the middle of the church, where again the priest offers incense in the four directions, forming a cross, and says prayers about how on the cross Christ opened the doors of paradise for us and restored us to our original rank. And then when he comes back and goes the last one, etc. I'm not going to say them all. You can look them up in your liturgy book or Coptic Reader app or Synaxis app, which is a really good app. Quick plug for Mina, because he's not going to do it. It's actually a really, really good liturgy app. Synaxis, Synaxis.
Is it on the App Store and the Google Store, Mina?
Just iPhone.
Just iPhone? All right, everyone get an iPhone. Okay, well that's really nice. Now, the question about something that you recently learned. I know, Buna, you always say this. You always say in 25 years of priesthood.
A little longer.
A bit longer. Maybe in the 2 years prior to that, you didn't. It wasn't as much. But so in all your years of priesthood, you obviously always learn something new, which is so beautiful to hear. Was there something recently that you learned?
Look, yes, even to the very last liturgy. The thing is, like, you want to stop and write it down so you can remember it.
Mm-hmm.
But then that would kind of defeat the purpose. It's like, if you're trying, the soap bubbles that kids play with, they look beautiful. But if you try to actually hold one in your hand, it pops. So it's a little bit like that. Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful experience when you're there, but then ask me afterwards, I can hardly remember. Look, there are many beautiful things in the liturgy. I mean, one thing that it's not very recent, but for a while, the incredible privilege of standing at the altar and holding the body of Christ in your hand during the institution narrative and speaking the words of Christ that he spoke at the Last Supper, and then the breaking of the bread. And it's if you time it right, the actions just correlate beautifully with the words. In the fraction prayer a little bit later on, part of the rubric is to take the big cross that's in the middle of the urbana, you remove it, and you touch it on your lips, and then you put it back. And again, if you time it right, that always correlates to a bit in the fraction prayer, whatever it is, where you're talking about God purifying us. And I think you can guess the connection there, right? Isaiah chapter 6, the seraphim takes tongs and gets a coal from the fire and touches Isaiah on the lips. And, having been afraid to approach God, once he's touched by the coal, he is now emboldened, and he says, "Here I am, send me." And that's exactly what's happening at the altar, right? The priest who has prayed all these prayers telling God, "God, you got this wrong. Why am I here? You know that I'm not worthy." I'm paraphrasing, right? It doesn't exactly say that. I don't deserve to be here. I'm not worthy. And then there's this lovely moment where, the coal of divinity touches the lips of the priest just before he's going to give the communion to everyone else. So he can say in his heart, "Here I am, Lord, send me. I'm happy to do this now. I'm ready to go out and do this." So yeah, it is incredibly rich. That's going to be my answer.
So beautiful. Thanks, Abuna. Mina, was there anything recently?
There is a beautiful fraction that mentions this Isaiah scene as well, which I really like. Is it the same question?
Yeah, something that you would have recently looked into or you learned that you can share with us.
I'll talk for 30 seconds about the gospel responses that you mentioned before, because this is something that is generally coming to light now. It appears that, so we're very familiar with the gospel response now on any non-feast days, Oneato, right? Blessed are the saints of this day. It turns out for Sundays specifically, there's a single response for every single Sunday reading. And the response matches the gospel that read exactly. It focuses on a particular event in the gospel or a particular verse and turns it into a prayer, turns it into praise. So we have a very rich tradition in that regard that for the most part we don't really use.
And is it all the same tune?
It depends on the period. So yeah, same tune if you're in annual days. In Kerk you'd say the Kerk tune, in Lent you'd say the Lenten tune. But they're very focused, and I think they show how Egyptians were very focused on scripture, right? Even when the gospel is finished, right, we read it, there's still more to draw out from it.
That's really, really nice. I think it's it goes back to the whole concept of is the church biblical? Is the liturgy biblical? It's just so much, right? It's just there's always elaboration, further prayers, always relating to the gospel. So really nice. Any final thoughts, Mark?
Well, if I had final thoughts, we'd never end. So I think I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Abuna and Mina. I think this has been awesome. Just diving deep into the liturgy and its history and the rites and Tazbaha and monasticism and Vespers, and we touched on so many topics. I really hope this can be edifying for everyone. I really thank you for taking the time and coming. So it's been really awesome.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for doing this podcast. I think it's a really lovely and useful thing, and yes, I agree. I hope all of us benefit from the experience.
You do a lot of work behind the scenes, so thank you for that.
It's nothing. It's God. God always blesses. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Awesome. Beautiful.